Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for February 17th, 2023. I will begin today with announcements of 3 events that are coming up. Put them on your calendar and be sure to participate in them because they do define a strategic perspective for addressing the war crisis and the overall degeneration of policies in the West. With the idea that we can get the truth out and use the truth to mobilize the populations to oppose the war hawks and neoliberals who control their governments. The first event is February 19th, this Sunday. It's the Rage Against the War Machine March and Demonstration in Washington, D.C. It will bring together a number of different groups, all of which have one point to make. Despite disagreements among them on many other things, they all understand the necessity of moving back from the threat of nuclear war by ending the war of NATO in Ukraine. So that's February 19th, this Sunday, and it will begin at the Washington Monument. You can find that by going to the Rage Against the War Machine and find the specifics on the time. Now, the second event is the Schiller Institute is going to have an emergency Zoom meeting on February 21st at noon Eastern Time. This will be on the, quote, Syrian sanctions must be lifted, unquote. Speakers will include Helga Zepp-LaRouche, Colonel Richard Black, who's been very outspoken against U.S. policy in Syria, and Vanessa Beeley, a journalist and expert on Syria, who will be joining them. Again, that will be on the 21st. Then the third event is on Thursday, February 23rd at 1 p.m. Eastern. And this is again a Schiller Institute Zoom event. Investigate the Nord Stream revelations, stop nuclear World War III. And the speakers there will include Colonel Ralph Bossard, who's a Swiss military intelligence veteran, retired, Ray McGovern, who most of you know, a very prominent anti-war activist who has a 27-year career in the CIA. And the main topic, Helga Zepp-LaRouche will be participating, the main topic will be taking up the revelations of Seymour Hersh's article, How America Took Out the Nord Stream Pipeline, and the demand for an investigation into Hersh's allegations. Now, the February 19th demonstration is coming under attack, as you might expect, not surprisingly. Among those attacking it is the Committee to Combat Disinformation, which is supposedly a Ukrainian organization, but it's funded by the United States government and the British government, and essentially coordinates its activities with NATO. It's put out a hit list of people it calls information terrorists and Russia propagandists. And it's been coordinated, as I said, with pro-war operatives of NATO who go to its meetings to draw up the list of targets. And prominent among that list are individuals associated with the Schiller Institute. In fact, the first name on the list continues to be Helga Zepp-LaRouche. It includes my name, Diane Sayre, people like Scott Ritter, Tulsi Gabbard, Tucker Carlson, and others. And the intent of this list is to threaten those who would speak out against the war. It's to stifle free discussion. It's a form of censorship. And it works closely with another website called Mirotvorets, which has been identified by leading intelligence officials as a hit list, a kill list. If your name is on this list, you could be in danger if you speak out. Now, what they're doing by putting this report out is trying to scare those who otherwise would support the policy of ending the war. Ironically, what does this mean? It means by continuing the war, the people who run this list and run these operations are condemning to death more Ukrainians and more Russians by continuing the war. Instead of diplomacy, they want to see more people killed. So if you want to talk about information terrorism, perhaps you should look at the people who are behind this list, including some of the leading neo-Nazis who argue that any attempt to have peace is part of a Putin talking point committed to war. Now, what is it that frightens the people who are behind this, the NATO pro-war sponsors? The creation of a broad coalition against continuing the war, and a broad coalition that would challenge the useless, corrupt military-industrial complex controlled politicians of all parties in the transatlantic region. That the idea that this mobilization will challenge that false consensus is what they're afraid of. Included in the February 19th march, for example, are as sponsors, the Libertarian Party of the United States, the People's Party, figures such as Ron Paul, Tulsi Gabbard, Diane Sayre, and others. So the threat to the system comes when people are armed with the truth and when they can wake up to the fact they're being controlled by disinformation coming from the corporate cartels that divide the population using identity politics, phony left-right dualism, and so on. And what threatens them is the awareness that it's this NATO, US, UK policy which is committed to global austerity, war, and coups against any government which threatens the control of the unipolar order. Whether it's a nation in South, Central America, Africa, or Asia, or powerful nations such as India, Russia, and China, if they threaten the rules-based order, they become targets. And the idea of a broad-based coalition emerging in the United States and Europe in particular against the war is a existential threat to the sponsors of the war policy. So give them nightmares. Become part of our movement and join the peace mobilization. Now, since it's Friday, I'm going to take a few questions. The first one, and this is actually was asked by a number of people, does the Hirsch article show that the Nord Stream pipeline sabotage, that's terrorism or an act of war? I would argue it's both. First of all, it was illegal. The idea that the president could, as Hirsch claims, the president could create a grouping of defense, security, State Department, intelligence committee that would have the purpose of conducting warfare without consulting Congress that violates the Constitution. Now, is it an act of war? Well, it destroyed a pipeline or pipelines, the purpose of which was to bring natural gas to Europe. It certainly interferes with a commercial enterprise, as there were a number of companies that were part of this, at least 4 or 5 NATO member countries and Russia. But the fact is that one could argue that this is an act of war against Germany. For what purpose? To prevent Germany from continuing its relationship that existed before the Ukraine war with Russia, where German industry benefited from cheap Russian fuel, and in return, the Germans would be involved in expanding trade and investment inside Russia. This has been a target of British intelligence since the launching of operations in the mid-19th century, such as the Crimea War, such as the so-called Great Game, such as Mackinder's geopolitics. The fear of a unity between Central Europe, especially Germany, with Russia oriented toward the east or toward the south, the Berlin-Baghdad Railroad was another such threat, that this was seen as an existential threat to the British Empire. So the fact that Biden, according to Hirsch, organized this act of sabotage against sovereign nations, including allies of the United States, such as Germany, as well as against a competitor, Russia, certainly could be considered an act of war, certainly is terrorism, and the people who did this should be prosecuted for illegal actions. What's necessary is a full investigation, and so far that has not taken place. Now, the second question, again, a number of people asked about the Chinese balloon incident, the shooting down of at least 3 more objects, which now the Defense Department says were not related to anything having to do with China. The fact that some people in the defense community are saying that there's no evidence that the balloon was deliberately steered over the United States raises the question of what was the purpose of this? Why was the hysteria created? Why use Air Force to shoot down these objects? What's the intent? It should be obvious, and I pointed this out in an article that you can find on my blog page on the LaRouche Organization website. The obvious point is that as the Ukraine war is moving toward an end which will not be good for the West, because the Ukraine is not going to win this war, there's a sense of urgency among the defense intelligence contract class to escalate against China. That if the war in Ukraine comes to an end, they want to have a second front. And the second front is related to the same issue, which is preventing a Russia-China alliance that moves outside of the collapsing unipolar order. And so the China war issue is a central feature of the thinking of the neocons and the war hawks. And we see it with all the talk about defending Taiwan's independence, which is not being threatened. Talking about China's bullying its neighbors. It's creating the debt burden against the countries that are part of the Belt and Road Initiative. All this is false. It's a bunch of lies. But then you add to that the idea of a balloon spying on American nuclear sites and military sites and spying on Americans, which some have called it, and that this is a violation of U.S. sovereignty. This is such nonsense. The people who are saying this are the ones who violate U.S. sovereignty by signing these international agreements with the World Health Organization, with the World Trade Organization, with the United Nations, and so on. They're the ones threatening U.S. sovereignty. What they want is to panic you into supporting a new multi-billion-dollar war expenditure budget, putting the U.S. in deeper debt for what purpose? To confront China? Well, how closely integrated are the U.S. and the Chinese economies? Just take a look and you'll see that this is an act of suicide, just as it's an act of suicide to break Germany from its commitment to, or the German dependence on cheap energy from Russia. These are suicidal policies being pursued on behalf of corporate cartels, which do not want sovereign nation states interfering with their ability to loot the world's resources and the world's populations. So when you hear people talking about threat to U.S. sovereignty and we must act decisively against the Chinese balloons, you probably got a whiff that there was something fraudulent about it, and that's absolutely the case. Now, finally, there was a question about, do we think there will be a escalated destabilization of Nigeria with the election coming up? Nigeria is one of those nations of the global South which has many reasons not to go along with the so-called rules-based order. One of the most important is it's the population, the largest population of a nation in Africa. It has resources. It has a commitment to economic development from its present government. But you also have an insurgency, a terrorist insurgency to destabilize the country. You still have the unhealed wounds from the Biafra operation in the 1960s, which has a British thumbprint on it. And what we know from the British is they don't want to see strong independent nations in Africa, in Asia, in South and Central America. That's part of the global order that's typified by what Blinken calls the rules-based order. So I would expect there will be destabilizations, economic pressures put on them, maybe an escalation of terrorism leading up to the election. in the effort to try and create confusion and chaos that will end up either determining the outcome of the election or threatening the continuation of democratic processes and economic modernization in Nigeria. That's the nature of the rules-based order. That's why we have to march against it. We have to stand up and be counted among those who recognize that no one gains from these kinds of wars except the corporate cartels that sponsor the whole war hawk movement. And in the United States, that's in both political parties. Now, let me leave you with a couple of jokes of slogans for the February 19th march, courtesy of our good friend Bill Ferguson up in Boston. One of the slogans he suggested is, "War, the only thing not made in China." And a second one, "Nuclear war will cancel your student debt and your life." So with that, I'm going to sign off for this week. For those who are interested, on Saturday, this week's Manhattan Project will include a discussion of the importance of the upcoming February 19th demonstration. You can find on the LaRouche organization site a link to the Saturday Manhattan Project. I'll be participating, Ray McGovern will be participating, and Dennis Speed will be moderating. There may be more information coming out about the courageous interventions being conducted around the team of Kainan and Jose Vega. So I would recommend, if you have some time on Saturday, join us for the Manhattan Project. So with that, I'll sign off and see you next week.